Okay, there we go. So for those of you who are new or haven't been here for a while, the way I like to start is if there's something that you're so excited about, maybe John, it was the quote from the that you just brought up, so excited
Yes.
about that you just can't wait to talk about. You're going to be antsy unless we get on it at the start. So I'm taking requests of places to jump in. Yeah, Eric, is that your hand?
It's not necessarily a topic that I want to make sure we get to before the end, but there's a sentence that I just could not understand what it meant, and I'm just trying to find the sentence right now.
And this is the one, right? We clear this up for you and everything falls into place.
Yeah.
The one sentence.
I'm having trouble finding it now. I'm sorry.
That's right.
1 second.
Could I ask, is it between at the top of page 10?
Oh. Yeah. Are you asking whether Eric's sentence there, or
That's not the,
we start there?
yeah,
Yes,
that's
is
not
that
the,
sentence the one at the top of 10, bottom of 9?
yeah, no,
Okay.
that's not the one.
Okay.
It's at the bottom of 5.
Oh, it's earlier. Okay.
The sentence, very bottom, when philosophical teaching in a purely conceptual understanding of the subject matter expresses only that subject matter's problematic and not its own.
Yeah.
Right.
That sentence, I just am having trouble getting what it's even saying. And I thought maybe German could help, but I was having trouble with that too.
Well, that is related to one issue that I don't know quite how to resolve. Okay, I'm not quite sure how to resolve. And that is that Gadamer is thinking that you have to see that Plato is self-reflexive, self-referential. He produced the Philebus as a dialectic about dialectic. Yeah. And so it's implicated in itself. Yeah. Aristotle does something different. Namely, Aristotle assigns to the concept a very specific task, which is to analyze the structure of the subject matter of thought and make it available in logos. And there are different areas of being, different kinds of being. And to each one, there is a set of concepts that are connected with each other that is appropriate to that, and that exhibits the specificity of that field of study.
That's the Aristotelian approach.
That's Aristotelian, but
Yeah,
that means that it's necessary to separate the conceptual scheme from its subject matter. The conceptual scheme should not be concerned with itself. It should sort of fade away and point to the subject matter. Does this mean that he thinks that there is not in Aristotle the kind of self-reflectiveness or self-referentiality that he finds in Plato? You know, I'm not sure what he thinks about it, and I'm not sure whether I would agree with it if he does think there is not that kind of self-reflectiveness in Aristotle. Okay, but it seemed to me that was the contrast in question, and it was,
yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Worried me. It worried me a bit. It sort of comes out at the end where he says, shouldn't go on and on. I'm sorry. Well,
you're doing great, Tom.
Okay, it sort of comes out at the end when he says, my approach also has a problem, because you have to follow, if you're going to be philosophical, you have to follow Aristotle and clarify concepts. But in doing that, you necessarily turn a deaf ear to the irony and the playfulness in Plato's texts. You're sort of like the humorless person listening to a conversation. Lose something, you know, but you have to do that for a philosophical interpretation. So it seems to have a very ambivalent kind of attitude toward Aristotle and toward conceptual formulation. Okay.
I think that's exactly right. And that's one of the main themes that are going on here, right? The relation between Plato and Aristotle and the two
Yeah.
things that they're doing. And then what we have to do if we're going to try to make sense of Plato, which has to be something a little more like Aristotle, and then what's lost in the process.
Mhm.
I'll make sure we've got this. Everyone good on that quote on the bottom of 5? Should we run it through one more time?
Yeah.
No, that was helpful. Thank you. We can move to top of 10 if that's another confusing sentence.
Yeah,
Well-
John asked about the top of 10. John
I-
Garner.
Okay, if I could just add one thing,
Oh, yeah, go ahead, John.
he says that we can't take Plato secondhand, like through Aristotle. Somewhere, where does he say that?
Well, he says something like that, but
Sure, we'll find it. I think that
yeah.
exactly what Don brought up will be one of the main things we talk about in the next.
Yeah, it's the
hours.
theme of the whole thing.
Yeah, exactly. So let's get some of these obscure quotes out of the way.
Yeah.
Relieve some of the anxiety. We put Eric at ease. No, let's put John Garner at ease. So John, what is it you were looking at?
Bottom of 9, the sentence before the troubling one that I just couldn't understand the grammar of, and I looked at the German too, and the German it's a one long sentence that's been chopped up in multiple in the translation. But it's the question is, for what methodological purpose are they under discussion? So is it with the goal of seizing the good that man encounters both pleasure and cognition in its highest potential, and thereby developing man's factual understanding of human existence further by working it out completely? I'm just, there's so many references like the it's, I'm not sure what they're pointing to. The German didn't help a lot, I'll say.
The German didn't help either.
It's just it's been chopped up in the English
I see.
appropriately. Yeah.
Okay. And we don't have any of the
Yeah.
clues of the gender pointing back to things, but
Yeah, that would help.
all right. For the question is, for what methodological purpose are they under discussion? The they is human existence, the human existence and the human good, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Okay.
this is what one must pay heed to in connection with talk about late Platonic ethics. It's not as though actual existence human, we're not under discussion here. I think, so I think when I think about late Platonic ethics, I think of Plato, often the Philebus is considered a late dialogue, one of the last ones. And although it's supposed to be about ethics, there's all sorts of metaphysics and epistemology and things in this dialogue. And so maybe there's a sense that, well, in these late dialogues, he's lost the concrete lived experience of Socrates and the examined life, and he's sort of moving off into abstract thoughts about the limits of theories of forms or something. But Gadamer would say, no, it's not that these things are lost. The question is, for what purpose are they? What purpose are we talking? Right, okay. And then it's the goal of seizing the good that man encounters in its highest potential, and there, oh my, I see what you said, John. So what is the its highest potential? The goal of seizing the good.
The
that
good.
man encounters, it's in the good's highest potential.
The good's highest potential. Yeah. That is the highest potential of being.
And thereby developing man's factual understanding of human existence further by working it's the good again, by working out the good conceptually. So is this something that bringing the good to concepts is something that helps us achieve our highest potential?
Yeah, I think I misled. I would revise and say the it refers to the good in human existence.
Oh, okay, not the good.
So if we're studying ethics, we want to discover the good in human existence.
I see.
Is it necessary to do that to work out its relation to the highest good, the highest form of that, the good, okay, and to work that out conceptually? And his answer is no.
Right.
This is not Plato's intention.
Yeah.
it's not Plato's intention in this dialogue? Or just in general?
I
Isn't
think
it
in general,
in general?
in this dialogue and in general, yeah.
Okay. John Beach, thanks. You got your hand up.
Yes, yes, I agree exactly with what Don's just said. And if we keep in mind, there's a very subtle critique of Heidegger that's going on here. And it's a bit of a truth and method in a nutshell here. But whenever he uses the word factual or conceptual, he's saying, well, this is not, Plato doesn't go that route. And there is no text in itself, no meaning in itself in Plato. And like Heidegger always said, until very late. So I think that if that helps, it's a living sort of thing, that this sort of engagement with Plato, we have to do just what Aristotle did, we have to do it directly with Plato. And that's the purpose of, that's why Plato wrote dialogues, I think. So we have to get our own reflective application individually, I think. That's how I read it.
John,
Yeah.
Garner, is this helping?
I think, yeah, though it certainly is helping me just get the lay of the context around the quote. Could I ask a question? Does anybody think that the structure of the sentence would go something like this? Plato's not trying to figure out what people factually prefer and then help us attain that better. Is that this gist of the sentence? Is there a level at which he's saying, look, we're not analyzing what people happen to prefer and then helping us get a better grip on that through conceptually arranging it or playing with ideas of what people factually or concretely desire? Instead, the end is rather to read off from the contents of the accomplished possibilities of human existence and so on. Is that the contrast? What's the basic instead? The instead is what follows there, or it is rather to read off. The goal is not this, it's rather this. What is the goal, I guess, is the question I'm asking.
I guess I thought the contrast, and Don, you should
Yep.
weigh in here. I thought the contrast was between, are we looking at these ways of life, pleasure, cognition, and the Phailibus, these are two alternatives, for the sake of understanding the good, the form of the good that shows up in the Republic that is beyond and transcendent?
Mhm.
Or are we just trying to understand the ways in which one might have precedence over the other as, in human life? That's what I thought it was, where the first one's a much
You're
more
right.
physical, speculative question, and the second one's a more practical question.
That makes perfect sense, because at the end of the syllabus, there's a ranking, if you will, or an ordering of which ones to be preferred before the other, with reason and whatnot before. I totally get it now, if that's what it's doing.
Don, does that track
Well,
what you were saying?
Yeah,
Yes, it does.
Yeah. That helps. Yeah.
I think I see it a little differently. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to articulate it or something, but it would be something like this. In Plato's notion, from the sort of massive variety and changeability of experience, we don't really grasp. You can't grasp that. Okay, it's just it's too complicated. So you have to have something stable, like an idea, and the function of the idea is to be knowable and to make the multiplicity of experience knowable. Okay, so what's the point of reflecting on our ethical behavior? Okay, and what will we gain by reflecting on it, and what good will it be for us? Will we come to a conceptual grasp of the good that will allow us to understand what ethical behavior would be? Okay. And he worries about this with Aristotle, because Aristotle has this conceptual structure, but Aristotle does insist it does have use in clarifying ethical choices that you make. It isn't just conception for conceptuality's sake. It does have some practical applicability, but the real aim here is not that for Plato. It's not sort of getting a conceptual grasp of the good that we can then, as it were, apply to our human existence, but rather the other direction. to discover in the good in our choices what backs that up, what constitutes the good, and in that way to reach a decision about what our fundamental possibilities should be and which has precedence over the other. So rather than going from the complexities of experience to a conceptual outcome, the idea is to see the ways in which that conceptual good is inherent in the activities that we're already engaged in. Okay, so that because he wants it to be immanent. He thinks that Plato does not want a separate good. The good only manifests itself in its actual presentations, its actual comings to be in our experience. Okay, I don't. That's pretty clumsily put, but I think that's where I'm going with it. But
And that is different than what I was saying, because that's
Yeah.
our focus of Plato is being closer to what we picture as Aristotle, right? Where the forms are implicit, they're contained in the lives and in the action rather than separate from them.
Yeah.
Eric.
Well, I wanted to riff on what Don was saying a little bit too, that for me, I was kind of simplifying it where, right, I'm thinking of the typical analytic philosopher teaching a course of ancient philosophy and talking about all of Socrates's bad arguments, right? Like, oh, his premises don't lead to the conclusion that he has, right? And so that's part of the extraction into like the Aristotelian framework of propositional or categorical logic, and then assessing Plato's dialogues in terms of whether it's a good or bad argument, compared to, Don, what you were saying, the good immanent in our activities, specifically the activity of participating in the dialogue itself, that it's the participation in the dialogue that is consummating the good or whatever, rather than you need to have this abstract concept of the good to give it a principle in your premises to conclusion and inferential relations between the ideas or something.
Yeah, good point. John Beach.
Just real quick here, on page 2, Gadamer, I think, puts a little bit of perspective on this. He says, first paragraph down, at the same time, I take it absolutely as a premise that Plato does not teach a philosophical ethics any more than he teaches any other philosophical discipline. And that would go into this contrast with Aristotle as well.
Right. Yeah, we're going to really need to get into this contrast. All right. That's going to be at the heart of our discussion. I was surprised. Some of these points seem sort of Heideggerian. That is, the approach that Don was just describing seems phenomenological to me. Right. We're going to go into the experience. We're going to look at the phenomenon. We're going to sort of tease out the essences from the phenomenon. This idea that that the point of Plato is to lead the reader toward the existential idea of the philosopher, right? It's by engaging in the dialogue, you're led down a path, which prepares you to be philosophical. Seems like a Heideggerian idea to me, especially when he talks about Dasein later as this sort of self-consciousness.
Yeah,
So I'm really here. I was really struck when John, you talked about we need to keep an eye out for the latent critiques of Heidegger in the text. But John Arthos, did you want to get in?
Yeah.
1 o'clock.
I don't necessarily disagree with that, but I wanted to affirm what you were saying, David, because in the preface to the second edition, because God wrote 2 prefaces, he says explicitly, my intention in writing it and what it is not just the introduction, but the whole book, right? The Philebus interpretation. My intention in writing it was really only to apply the art of phenomenological description, which I just learned to a Platonic dialogue. And then in the actual introduction, there's a paragraph where he actually as much as defines what that method is, or what that art is, and I can find that in a minute, but clearly that's his intention.
Mhm.
Right. And he, of course, he was working with Heidegger on this. You get from the Grand Dame, he wrote it very
Yeah.
quickly
Yeah.
in spirit of Heidegger.
Well,
Down here in the chat, I wanted to say that that Henry found the secondhand quote. It's the remark at secondhand on page 8. One that was mentioned earlier. Thank you, Henry. You want to, Henry, you want to show us where it is?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is the correct one, but
Yeah, that's the one.
second, like right above the second paragraph from the top. So like where above the philosophy for Plato, right above that, there is like the first sentence discovery that Plato is more than what Aristotle, blah blah blah, and then yeah, itself conveys second hand. So I think that's where we were alluding to.
Should we look at this whole paragraph? We need to sort of get into this, start mapping out both how he sees the relation, what Aristotle's doing and Plato's doing, and what he has to do in order to apply the phenomenological approach to a Platonic dialogue. And are you up for reading it?
My voice is a little bit scratched today. Maybe
Okay.
I'll leave it.
No,
to someone
right. It's okay. You're off the hook.
I'm happy to if it.
Go ahead, Eric.
All right. So much can be foreseen both historically and philosophically regarding the problematic of Aristotle's relation to Plato.
Mhm.
But just as all reflection in the relation between concepts and what is living can itself be grasped only in concepts, so the Platonic existence of philosophy can be grasped philosophically only if one repeats oneself the same kind of projection onto the conceptual plane that Aristotle undertakes. Do we want to pause there?
Yeah, let's pause there.
Right. Well, so I see a kind of complex issue. It sort of starts out saying there's historical interpretation and philosophical interpretation.
Mhm.
And it kind of ends on the same note. And it says, you know, you have to be answerable to history, but nevertheless, philosophical interpretation is different from historical interpretation. So the question is, so what is philosophical interpretation? What does it look like? Okay. And it has to involve conceptualization. Because after Aristotle, philosophy involves conceptualization. Okay.
Right.
And conceptualization always flattens phenomena. Yeah. So you wind up with two firsthand discoveries. One is when you're reading Plato, the firsthand discovery is that you're missing something when you conceptualize Plato. Okay. The dialectic doesn't work that way. The dialectic does not produce a doctrine. And you need to rediscover that for yourself. It's not just an idea. You need to sort of experience it through yourself. But the same is true with Aristotle. That is, you have to have the firsthand discovery that Aristotle's conceptualizations flatten the phenomena to a certain extent. Okay. And that means you have to read Aristotle's. I think it means ultimately that you have to read Aristotle the right way. You can't reduce Aristotle to some rigid system of stipulative definitions that all fit together in a logically coherent way. That's not what Aristotle's doing. Aristotle also is describing phenomena. He's just being very faithful to those phenomena. Okay, and there are lots of signals in Plato that he doesn't, in Aristotle, that he's not rigidifying conceptualization. Okay, so you have to make on each side, you have to make this firsthand realization. Okay.
that makes sense. Henry, your hand's up.
Yeah, this reminds me of a little bit of like when Husserl discusses how we look at the physical things, we have to combine the many manifolds. But this is an application of that kind of similar experience in a conceptual framework. Like when we analyze, in this case, Plato, like we have to go through like Aristotle's perspective and like different kind of perspective, and it kind of forms different kind of manifolds and combine them together. Like I get a sense that it is something a little bit like that.
So can I jump in, David?
Yeah, John, yeah, please.
I maybe have a nuanced difference with the direction of his exposition here, because so first of all, I mean, not just here, but in all of his writings, he's always trying to correct the impression of contrasting Plato with Aristotle. That's one of his major themes, is that you have to read them together, right? There's a sense in which they're collaborating on the same sort of hermeneutic truth. But and he actually says that here explicitly at the end of his polemic against Aristotle, which is on page 12, which he says, it's the sentence about 2/3 of the way down that starts, that is, in the explicit disagreement between Plato and Aristotle, we seek the identical foreconception that links them together. So that's what he wants to do in general. But what was striking to me in this introduction is that starting from about page 7 all the way to that sentence, he's really expressing his preference for Plato, right? And he's saying, again and again and again, he's saying how Aristotle does not do the thing that Don's saying that we should not do, which is to, rigidify the category and seek pure reason. But he sort of starts us on the way. He's the one who sets the ball in motion that then becomes this, pursuit of pure reason and the categorialization. That's what I see him saying here. And he says that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times he comes out and says, wrong direction.
Yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead, John.
Yeah, John Beach.
Yeah, I followed you, John, up until the end there, because I think that his point is that I think he makes this near the end. Its point is more, there's still something in Plato that Aristotle can never replace, something that's valid philosophically today, but that is not necessarily to say that Aristotle is wrong, or that what Aristotle, maybe there's a bit of that, because again, that's Heidegger, like, was very, very much approached Plato through Aristotle, dogmatically in a way. But I don't know. I think that, and I would say that, like, Aristotle has this he's driven amazingly by this inner consistency for the order of all things. And it's really quite powerful. And even though it is flat, I don't think it withstood 2,000 years. It's pretty good. And so I'm just throwing those ideas in as well to the stew, if you will.
Well, just to John's Arthur's point, I may put this too boldly or something. I mean, maybe I'm putting it wrongly or something, but Gadamer talks a lot about Plato, and he clearly is interested in liberating Plato from the Neoplatonic conception of Plato and the risk of two-world metaphysics, all of that. He's trying to get rid of all of that. Less elaborated, but I think he's pointing that he also wants to liberate Aristotle from the scholastic tradition that interprets Aristotle. Okay. and recover Aristotle as responding to the realities of Greek life, and to find the human things behind the things that Aristotle is saying. And in this, I agree with him, it's phenomenology. I mean, he's trying to find phenomenology in both of them, connect them with, and he calls this the ontological foreconception. Our task is to clarify the ontological foreconception of what they're saying. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Don-
and what they both share, right? But
Yeah.
they're both, what they both share.
Yeah.
Don, I totally agree with that. I mean, so maybe a way of putting that is he's trying to find the inner Plato and Aristotle. Right. But
Nice.
nevertheless, I still maintain, could we look at a passage? Because I think there's there's a couple of passages where what I'm saying I'm seeing.
Absolutely. Where are you looking?
So this is on page 7, where halfway through, where it starts. Aristotle projected Plato onto the plane of conceptual explication, right?
Mhm.
Bad. The Plato who presents himself in this explication is the object of Aristotle's critique. What makes this critique problematic, Gadamer's saying that that's problematic, is that this projection cannot also catch the inner tension and energy of Plato's philosophizing as they speak to us with such incomparable convincingness in his dialogues. And this goes back to the thing he's saying from the beginning of this introduction, which is that the thing that is so significant and so different about Plato's dialogue, Plato's philosophizing from the rest of the sort of Western categorical tradition, is that it's so richly and deeply anchored in life, right? He says, the goal is, after all, is to argue from the general ontological idea of the good precisely to the good of actual human existence. So he doesn't want us to separate out and flatten, right? So he's saying Plato is the one who's doing that. Aristotle is starting to get us away from that. And then he goes on in the passage, the unique importance of this critique is that it is not a historical riddle presented by a radical misunderstanding in a one-type situation, blah, 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 but an expression of the systematic problem of philosophy itself, that the part of lived reality that can enter into the concept is always a flattened version. Okay, the problem. And then in the next sentence, the gain in unambiguous comprehensibility and repeatable certainty is matched by a loss in stimulating multiplicity of meaning. So all I'm saying is that the tendency that Aristotle is sending us on is in the first parts of that sentence. The tendency that Plato wants to pull us back into is in the second half, and Gadamer agrees with Plato.
Absolutely. Yeah. Beautifully put.
yeah. And Gadamer is the master of multiplicity of meaning.
Can I, with that, riffing off that multiplicity of meaning on page, no, I'm not seeing it. Where he talks about liquefying. Oh, it's at the bottom of 10.
Yes.
Right? These formulation of substantive insights, it's like 3 lines from the bottom. All these formulations of substantive insights must be liquefied again. What?
Wait.
What? This comes up in Gadamer a lot, right? Like you want to keep concepts fluid. He talks about fluidity in Truth and Method, right? So is this multiplicity of meaning that we were just talking about, right? Aristotle sediments, whereas Plato liquefies. Is that on the conceptual plane?
Nathan, the opposite of liquefaction is on page 10. And again, he points to Aristotle. It's middle of page 10. He says, here, the modern philosophical interpretation of Plato does not simply repeat what Aristotle characterizes, Aristotle's critique of Plato, which takes as terminologically fixed what in Plato was still not meant to be terminologically binding at all. So that's the opposite of liquefied.
Yeah.
Henry,
I want to go back to the point before the liquefaction. Um,
back to page 7.
like, yeah, I think like after page 7, but Gadamer goes back to defend Aristotle a little bit. Like if we look at the top of page 8, like about like 8 lines in, he says all scientific philosophy is Aristotelianism insofar as it is conceptual work. I think what he means is like, even though like he values the multiplicity of meanings, he sees like no direct path to those meanings except by this kind of conceptualization work, right? So like it's not like Aristotle is like doing something horrible, but it is kind of the only way he can do it, but we can do it in a different way. So like Aristotle has his own way of conceptualizing it, but there are like we can also try a different way of conceptualizing it. So like it's not as like so I see like Gadamer defending both Plato's and Aristotle's here. It's not as strong as like Plato's or Aristotle, but like both of them has something valuable in this in here.
I think that's great. And that was that was the paragraph we were reading through, right, one at a time. I was confused about that. Let me just ask this quickly. When he says that same sentence, Henry, I want to know what you think about this. He says, if one wants to interpret Plato's philosophy philosophically, one must necessarily interpret it via Aristotle. Now, does he mean via the Aristotelian approach, or literally via Aristotle's own reading of Plato, which sees Plato as having certain problems and limitations? And so the question is, you have to take the tradition seriously and see the way Plato was received by his own students. And this is the way in which you understand Plato conceptually, is through the way the tradition understands him, or is it more Aristotle as us just referring to a method?
Yeah, I think when I read it, like my first impression was it refers to the method, because I think a little bit before this, he said like Aristotle was the first to develop this kind of conceptual methodology, and because like with the link to like all like it's a very big claim, right? Like all scientific philosophy is Aristotelianism. So in this sense, I feel like he's using the word Aristotle in a very, very broad sense here, maybe. So that's the sense I got when I read it, but I'm not sure if this is correct.
Yeah.
No, another way to read that we must read Plato through Aristotle is to read it as that we cannot avoid reading Plato through Aristotle, right? Because we're a part of tradition.
That makes sense. I'm going to jump. William, we have a new voice here, and then we'll do John Beach.
One thing I was just going to say is in places Gadamer makes comments about Plato's dialectical ethics. And one thing he does say about it, he felt he emphasized too much that Plato was only a preparation for Aristotle. So, you know, in his later work, it wouldn't I think necessarily be so much through Aristotle. And another thing he also says is that Plato's doctrine was pushed too much to the background too. So it's kind of interesting to consider it. And he says things about it in other places too, different things.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
I was feeling that sort of tension myself, that, you know, treating Plato just as sort of a guide to a certain kind of life seems to put aside so many views he seems to embrace and hold and argue for. I'm glad to hear he says something a little different later. But all right, John Beach.
Yeah, I remember Gadamer saying that Aristotle, this is a very general statement, but that Aristotle wanted something that people could relate to and that could use and benefit from without going through the struggle and the labor of the dialectic and you know the theoretical anyway, I think that was So that's why like Aristotle wrote sort of an ethics, whereas Plato wasn't quite at that stage yet. But I think Gadamer too is very sensitive to the way that what Aristotle said, his concepts came, out of the language itself in order to get away from the mythologizing that was in Plato. When Plato would run into a barrier, Aristotle tried to find a way of expressing it in language itself. And you can see how a lot of his concepts are made up out of participles and stuff like that, the toti t and all this stuff. And in a way, it was the Greek language sort of had Aristotle in a way that was, I think, so I wouldn't put Aristotle here as a sort of Heideggerian type of metaphysics, sort of as a bad metaphysics. I wouldn't go that far. But I mean, that's always, but Plato is the one that opens things up for us, and philosophical thinking that helps us to creatively relate to language in a new way. I don't know if that helps at all.
Yeah, absolutely. Eric.
Yeah, connected right along with that on page, page 2, right almost smack in the middle. The sentence goes, the dialogues are comprehended in their own intention only when one understands them as serving to lead the reader toward the existential ideal of the philosopher, like we said at the beginning of the discussion. But that stood out to me because he says that the dialogues have their own intention. He's not ascribing the intention to Plato as like the author's intent, right? That we get into with hermeneutics and whatnot. But just that the dialogues have this intention or purpose, to serve the reader this way, like John, you were saying.
Yeah.
I just want to say his attitude toward Aristotle is very complicated and very nuanced and hard for me to sort it out because he seems to go different directions. On this question of Aristotle flattening by projecting Plato onto the plane of conceptual thinking, on page 12, he says, we are sort of following, but the modern philosophical interpretation of Plato, the middle of the page, does not simply repeat what characterizes Aristotle's critique of Plato. We don't just do it that way.
Right.
We have to do something else, and that something else is we have to not terminologically clarify and fix Plato, but to find the tendencies of meaning which escape Aristotle's conceptual standard. The tendencies of meaning. Is there a difference between conceptualizing and discerning the tendencies of meaning? Because what follows that is then saying that there is this ontological foreconception which Plato and Aristotle share. And that they share, that links them together, brings us to an unchanging view of the reality in question. That is, what they share is they're both talking about human existence. And sort of they have the same view of it, but they kind of approach it differently. But I don't really understand. It's a kind of a metaphor. I don't really understand what these tendencies of thinking. What is he talking about here?
Well, I would say that another thing they share is that they both done the turn to the logoi, which sets them off from all the pre-Socratics. And when he's talking about modern, he's talking about himself, and not what's going on, as Andrew Furchuk, who knows the history of German Plato interpretation before Gadamer and Heidegger very well. And then but then he brings that up still to differentiate it from the historical approach, historical scholarship, which does characterize contemporary philology. And he says but it doesn't evade this historical criticism. It can stand up to it, but nevertheless, it's not reduced to it. And I think this goes back to the original principle that philology and philosophy cannot be divorced. And I think that's what he's leading toward here. And that is also a criticism of Heidegger as well at that time for Gadamer, subtle for his supervisor. But I think that's, I mean, that became clear became clear later. And because it was Heidegger who was not, as accurate and as precise and meticulous with the history and the philology aspect of it.
John Arthos, can I jump in and bring us back to 7? Because there's something on 7 that I think that's just interesting. In late antiquity, it was common to read Aristotle and Plato together as if they're both saying the same thing, a different emphasis. Plato was the elevated one, Aristotle was the road to Plato. And then the problem they all had to solve was what we make about Aristotle's criticisms of Plato, because it shows up in the ethics, shows up in the metaphysics, in De Anima. And they said, well, this was just a tool for students. They should recognize the flaws in these criticisms, and that's part of the way in which they learn the true Plato views. And I think Gadamer's interested in those criticisms too, because he's concerned about, is it Jaeger? He's concerned about the developmental idea, the idea that, Aristotle moved away from Plato, maybe took Plato with him as he moved away from Plato, and Plato learned from Aristotle to reject things like this. And so in 7, he says, and this paragraph we've been focusing on, Gadamer makes this interesting argument where he says, we've talked about this, Aristotelian conceptual investigation itself is necessarily understood on the level of the concept if it's supposed to be understood philosophically. Okay, that's how we approach something philosophically. On this level, Aristotle necessarily wins the argument with Plato. The meaning and justification of Aristotle's critique of Plato are still a controversial problem. And one of the criticisms is you focus on the good, but focusing on the good doesn't actually tell you anything more than what you would know already from just living well. There's nothing added by saying, and this is good. What I've been saying was meant to make it clear that this problem is not accidental, or represents a necessary state of affairs, not something in principle that can be resolved like any other interpretive problem. The conclusion that Aristotle misunderstood Plato is rightly felt to be impossible. The thought is, well, Aristotle's not going to get Plato wrong. He was there at the school for 20 years, right? If Aristotle says this is Plato's view, it's Plato's view. And so Gadamer seems to be taking this line, and it'd be something like, I can imagine somebody doing a philosophical criticism of a poem. And you would say, well, on one hand, you're right. When we think about the poem that way, it's wrong. But that's not what a poem is doing or trying to do, or that's not the way that we still find ourselves moved by the poem nonetheless. So, right. So the idea is somehow he wants to have it both ways, right? Say Aristotle's right. Plato, if you conceptualize Plato, then Plato is subject to these criticisms. So the problem isn't with what happens when you conceptualize Plato. The problem is reading Plato this way, or something much more basic, right? And that's why he wants to go on and say, so what do Plato, and instead of focusing on this debate and the progress of Plato to Aristotle and how Plato moves beyond Plato, let's ask, what do they share in common? What's going on behind the scenes, in the way that you might look at a debate and say, we have two sides of the debate, but we can, in a Hegelian move, we can say, but they both take for granted something deeper. So it looks like a disagreement where there's not actually a disagreement there. I have a feeling something like that is happening. Does that resonate with what other people think is going on here?
Well, if I may quickly respond to that.
Yeah.
There is a stage where Gadamer says that Aristotle does find an inconsistency or a limit in Plato's thought, and he advances beyond it. This was in Amicus. We love Plato, but we love the truth more, type of thing. And so there's something about, and there are concepts in Plato as well, but Aristotle goes, goes all the way for it and toward it. And I think that to your more, David, more precisely to your question, I don't think it's an either or. I think it's Gadamer's trying to express a philosophical, something that language, it has more to do with language and language's relationship to truth than it does one philosophical theory to another. And they're both equally great thinkers. They both had a lot in common. And so I don't think and Aristotle's reading of Plato is not, well, his criticism is like he has to, he has an entirely different ontological thing, whereas they both have this concept of the eidos well, he said here for Plato, it's reality, but for Aristotle, the reality is the toti ti, the individual, the thing, and so that creates, and Aristotle's entirely consistent with that throughout his philosophical works. And so he said, and Gadamer would say there is a validity to that criticism that Aristotle makes of Plato. So it's tough. It's not
Right,
finished.
that's what we're working on, trying to straighten this all out. John Arthos, do you want to get back in here? I jumped ahead of you.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think, John, I think you've got it right by keeping, you continually bring up this relationship between language and concept, or philology and philosophy, and Gadamer says that we can't separate them. And I think that's so. David, you're pointing out this sentence, Aristotle necessarily wins the argument with Plato. So that's a really good catch there. And what he says, on this level, he's talking about on the level of the concept. That's in the previous sentence, right? So what that makes me remember is that, so Gadamer wrote that essay, from language to concept, that essay. And then by the end of the essay, he's really saying, we really need to move from the concept to language, right? I mean, and so that's his bias. That's what he wants us to recognize. And that sort of that's the Platonism in him. So I guess in terms of this tension, I think that's really a valid finding, that this tension continues in Gadamer, that he recognizes that the Western intellectual history, as much because of Aristotle as anyone, is because we have to move beyond just our being in life, being in language, that there is some need for the articulation and the differentiation that conceptual thinking does, right? I mean, I just think that because Western intellectual culture, rationalism, categorical thinking went so far in that direction, he's finding it necessary to rebalance that tension.
Yeah,
Yes.
I see that.
Can I just add in support of that? So on page 3 and 4, he's talking about Socrates and so forth in Plato's philosophy and the dialectic in Plato. It's dialectic. This isn't just a method of matter of convenience and means to an end. I mean, dialectic is it, and because man is a creature that is on the way and between. Man is self-transcending. Okay, so dialectic is in fact carrying out what human being is. And so the goal is, he will say later in the Philebus, to become dialectical, for the human being to become dialectical. And the protreptic element here is to draw us into becoming dialectical, which means, as he says on page 12, and I still don't understand this, he talks about the dialectical provisionalness of Plato. But he says we can't stop there. We, you know, as interpreters, we have to clarify conceptually. But so at the bottom, he says at the bottom of 12, he says, the unchanging view of reality in question, which everywhere moves Plato together with Aristotle as soon as one dares to go beyond the provisionalness of Plato's dialectical explications. That daring to go beyond, I mean, where do we get when we dare to go beyond? Not to Aristotle's kind of conceptualization, but to something else. What else?
Well, but Don, it's not that we don't get to Aristotle's conceptualization. It's just that Aristotle's conceptualization is one of the many options of
Yes,
responding to the provisionalness of Plato's dialectical
yes.
terminology.
Right,
We're all invited in. Aristotle is a good role model of one option for run. Right. What's your response to Plato's dialogue going to be?
Yeah.
Aristotle's is one projection, he says at one point. And that's this next sentence in the paragraph that we've been reading on 8.
Oh, that's right. We're still in the middle of paragraph on 8. We haven't finished that one.
Yeah. The historic, can I read the next sentence in that
Yeah,
one?
do, please, yeah.
The historical realization that this will always be a projection cannot be made productive by trying to dissolve or avoid this projection. I think he's talking about you can't avoid making some projection or another. That echoes Eric's point. Some projection or another when dealing with this, you do need to conceptualize it, crystallize it into a conceptual thought.
Wow.
Yeah, you know, I think that's right. And I was trying to figure out how all this fits with the very first quote that we tried to make sense of, Eric's, where it talks about philosophical teaching. This is the time that words, language, for the first time acquire the real task of the concept. Right? It seems he seems to talk about conceptual understanding as being really valuable and something that language always pushes us toward doing. It takes this, it analyzes the structure of the subject matter of thought and makes it available to logos. So it seems like there is a positive side to this conceptualizing. It can't capture everything that's going on in Plato, but it can't be avoided either. And it's not mere loss, I would think, right? There are gains to it, philosophizing, philosophically addressing these things. Does that, John Garner, does that sound like what you got there in 8 so far? You want to finish the paragraph, John? We can check that one off.
Sure, we can. I doubt we'll fully move on, but we'll see.
We'll finally get to that secondhand quote.
So the first-hand discovery that Plato is more than what Aristotle and conceptual analysis can extract from him cannot itself be conveyed secondhand. Stop there or keep going?
No, it's good. No,
Okay.
take us home.
It stands at the limit of all Plato interpretation, just as there stands at the limit of all conceptual work in philosophy, the realization that all interpretation makes its object univocal, and by providing access to it, necessarily also obstructs access to it.
Yeah. And he talked about the univocity on 12, that it's an obligatory task for philosophical interpretation. But then we also have, this is the question earlier, we lose the tendencies of meaning. And it's like, well, what is that? What is it we've lost? What are these things that?
Aren't we losing the liquidity or fluidity or whatever, right? Like, to me, that seems at the bottom of, is it the bottom of 8? No, it's the bottom of 10. Back to that. What's the gain of being fluid? And for me, I just can't help but connect that to fluency, right? Like that somebody has fluency. John, I see, Arthos, I see you're shaking your head, so please go for it.
No, he's talking about multiplicity, the ambiguity and the multiplicity of meanings that ordinary language has, right? And that ordinary language has for us in our lives, right? Which is rich, which is also can be confusing, but it can also be rich, and that's what he sees in Plato. But he says, but this tension that we're talking about. So because of that, there's also this need to find to make an effort towards the univocal, right? There's a phrase, Hegel has this idea. He points to the German historicists and Hegel, and have this phrase, the rising to the universal, and so he sort of agrees with that conception but disagrees with that conception, right? So rising to the universal would be like rising to the concept, to the univocal concept. And rise and so he wants both, and he says we need both.
I think there's what we see kind of nascent here is the idea of hermeneutic application, and which is original with Gadamer, I would think, although very much inspired by Heidegger. And so I would just throw that in. That's why I think this is sort of a truth and method in a nutshell here.
Yeah. Abdullah, do you want to get in here with the comment you put in the chat? Because I think that could be helpful too.
Yeah. So what I was saying, this is what Gadamer does in his hermeneutics, right? Not reducing philosophy to historical criticism. It was on page 12, but then on page 13, we see like B, the endeavor of this kind of philosophical interpretation has always been to construe matters of course. And this is also the case when it is confronted with historical texts. So is philosophy for Gadamer an interpretive way of conceptualizing what we understand in a historical or an eminent text, I'm sorry, rather than analytical argumentation? Do we do philosophy, we hermeneuticians, by means of reading? Reading here is a technical term, of course, like appropriating the text or making the subject matter our own. Yeah. Does it make sense?
Yeah, John Beach.
Yeah, I see this matter, of course. I had to think about that for a while, but I think by matter, of course, he's thinking about historicism, and where we don't bring in the hermeneutic application, and where we I think that makes that whole paragraph, it brings a unity and a coherence to it if you see it that way. But man, Gadamer is very subtle when he criticizes other people or criticizes. You got to really dig it or dig down deep.
Right. Can I just continue with that, because I think Abdullah, that passage was very obscure to me. It was very obscure to me. It clarifies the distinction he's making between a historical interpretation and a philosophical interpretation. And at the heart of it seems to be the idea that something conceals itself that wants to evade the grasp of comprehension in everyday experience, and that we have to not let it slip out into self-evidence. Okay, for the historian, it becomes self-evidence. He uses that at the and I thought the idea of application is here, because at the bottom of page 13, he says, the path of interpretation conceptualizes what we understand when we proceed from a substantive understanding of our own of what is discussed. And that sounds like application, but not with the intention of promoting our understanding or imposing it. Okay. So this is like sifting prejudices, productivity of prejudices, but to understand what was understood there, to understand it again. And then he goes on to this strange remark on 13 and 14, and that will have if it works, it will have an immediate evidence that is superior to all roundabout historical deduction and investigation. What? I'm lost, you know.
Yeah, that's quite a claim.
I'm reading that through Boltman a little bit there, where it's like, right, like thinking of the charisma, where if I put the resurrection in historical context, and I'm like, it's a fact that this biological organism was resuscitated on this date, versus the good news to me, right? It's the charisma that has its own evidence that's superior to any historical archaeological find. That's how I was interpreting that.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah.
But I think what's supposed to strike us as so self-evident is how he's got the dialogue. I mean, he's got to write a book, right, on the Plato's Philebus. And he's going, this is about how am I going to do this? Take seriously what Plato is doing, right? And doesn't this become an Aristotelian investigation of his use of concepts or something, or do it like historically, here's where the Philebus fits in the arc of Plato's thought, or so it's not just what it speaks to me, but we're supposed to read this and say, yeah, that's what he's after. That's the theme, that's the topic, that's the scopos, or whatever, is that the right? That's what's driving this. And the process that Gadamer is going through as a reader, as a reader, and as someone writing
is
this,
Gadamer a reader though? Is he calling himself a humorless listener at the end of 14? Is he saying that you need to have the attitude of a humorless listener?
I was using reader in a sense Abdullah talked about it, but we could look at that humorless reader comment. Where's the line again?
Page 14, about 12 lines up.
Yeah, okay.
Its attitude is that of a humorless listener to the conversation. Because it's like somebody who's explaining the joke to you.
That's right. That's exactly what I thought.
And now I explain the joke to you.
It's no longer funny anymore.
No. And yet I may explain it. I may actually explain what was so funny about it. It's just, it's not funny once I explain what's funny about it.
Yeah. Clarify the imminent meaning content of the dialogue by elucidating the problems of its mode of composition.
Right.
So he says at one point, and I don't have enough background to know if this is the case, at the very end he says, only in the Philebus you have the unity of dialogue and the dialectic. Of all of Plato's literary works, only in the Philebus do you have this sort of where it comes together.
He's
I have an answer to that, I think.
Oh yeah. Great.
Somewhere he says it's not, the point isn't to philosophical, it very early on isn't to philosophically understand something, but it's to do it. However he puts that.
I think the Philebus, I mean, I hadn't seen that comment, but that makes sense to me. I mean, it's strange that it's the only one, but what he's doing, what Plato's doing in the Philebus is, it's an exemplary example of the method of dialectic, right? It's a very dry, abstract, and it goes on endlessly. about the relationship between the one and the many.
Mhm.
Using these techniques of the diuresis and everything. So, and also it's this very human engagement in the question of the good. So maybe that's what he's talking about. Right. He has this very human dialogue with his friends that are present with him. It's right in the middle. It starts right in the middle of things. They've been discussed before. So it's very dialogic in that way. And yet it's also very dialectical in the way that he teaches us how the method of dialectic has to work. So it's both.
Okay.
And this is the nature of phronesis too. It's knowledge, but it's not only knowledge. It is a mode of knowledge, but it's also a commitment to being something.
Yeah. Yeah.
On that commitment point, something David said earlier about how you have to engage, or we were talking about the projection, you have to engage in this activity of projection. You have to be on the way to the univocal, put in a different language that we've discussed today, that being on the way. It reminds me of page 3, about 2/3 of the way down, where he starts talking about how the good for the human is in the referring to the good. Did anybody remember that passage? And so it reminds me of what John just said about you have to take a stand, but it doesn't become just sheer relativism when one takes that stand, because one still does take oneself to be referring to a good that others could take their stand on too, and it could be communicated. It's not incommunicable with others. It's precisely communicable with others. But you do have to take a stand, it seems like. You have to make that reference to the good. I guess I could read it. For Plato, actual human existence and the concept of the good in this human reality are not in themselves treated as objects to be defined and held in safekeeping, but instead are defined as referring to something else that alone really exists and is really good. And they are defined as something that really exists only in this referring. That is, as something dependent on what they refer to.
Yeah.
That connects with the top of 11 for me, where he's criticizing clinging to definitions or concepts or doctrines, and saying that as a question of the course of questioning that the dialogue presents, and to describe the directions in which Plato, without following it, only points. So this same referring, it makes me think of the Zen parable about, like, don't look at the finger, look at the moon that the finger's pointing to, or something. Gadamer brings this up with dogs too, right? Like the dog doesn't follow you pointing to the finger.
Yeah, and this striving, which is essential, this Aristotle talks about too with hexis, as that's the core of the ethics. It's Nicomachean ethics. It's a form of striving. Yes.
Sharon, yeah, get in here.
Hi there. Thank you so much for this great conversation. I'm fairly new at this, so just wanted to, this last little bit of conversation reminded me of the midway point in page 10, where he talks about das in turn toward being and being good, and it's in the loss and forgetfulness of self, which goes with enjoyment and with passion, or in the state of being conscious, which retains everything itself and everything and expects itself from everything. So that sense of phronesis, but actually I put the word play, that concept of Gadamerian's play of you being in the moment, and it's through the play and the structure of the play where you lose yourself, but you also find understanding. And that can really resonate with me with what people were just talking about here as well.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. I think we're just adding on to John Beach's thesis that all truth and method can be found in an introduction from 1927. But right, yeah, I mean, that loss of forgetfulness and enjoyment, that does sound like play.
Aaron, building off of that, is there something about, and this connects John back to John Garner, what you were saying earlier about referring also, is there something crucial to referring to the good that requires self-negation of some sort, right? The self-forgetfulness so that the good can become apparent, right? Like I'm thinking of in Truth and Method when Gadamer talks about the kid who dresses up as Spider-Man. I guess I say Spider-Man, but he doesn't say Spider-Man, but the kid wants to be seen as Spider-Man, not the kid, right? And so there's something about self-negating there. Is that a requisite of reference or pointing, John Gardner, that you were referencing earlier?
Well, not thinking that your projection fully captures, I think is important there. And so the loss that you're describing, the loss in the loss of self would be important because he contrasts the loss of self in that passage Sharon just read with the state of being conscious, which retains itself in everything and expects itself in everything. That seems to be a critique of thinking that you've got that concept fully within your grasp. Knowledge, in a certain sense, is being criticized there as not alone the good, which is part of the point of the Philebus, right? Also pleasure, also the forgetting of self, also the other side of that. So yeah, I think it connected.
And I think it's like an awareness of oneself ultimately that leads one to the good. And it's kind of like a being who you are. It's sort of an ultimate truth. And it has the good has this ontological, is the ultimate ontological reality. So it's and in the Philebus, it becomes really clear like how the mixing of the two ultimately, well, the pleasure that's the best pleasure is when you're aware of it and you understand it and you experience it with full, not using it as a forgetting of yourself or an escape. Yeah, so that's the way I see that.
Yeah, great. Henry, good.
Referring back to the same passage above, like I think that passage leads to accumulates in a comparison between Plato and Aristotle on the top of page 5, which I find a bit puzzling. I'm wondering if we can look a bit into that.
Absolutely.
So like on the top of page 5. Yeah, so like after he talks about in length about like Plato's of like referring to the good. So here he does a small comparison between Plato. So like the first part is like he says Plato's always see man's experience, and then like defined by a creature who transcends himself. So this is the referring that he was talking about. But then like he talks about Aristotle, which in this part I've never seen such an interpretation of Aristotle. So this is why I find it a bit puzzling. So he says Aristotle, on the other hand, sees both the reality of human life and also this extreme possibility of theory. And then I skip a little bit, and then he says Aristotle sees a second best life, which is still a best life. And then a little bit is the one limit of this completion is the new fundamental incompletability. So this is, I find this part really puzzling. I've never seen this kind of interpretation of Aristotle before, so I'm wondering like if we can try to get some insights on that.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I went too quickly. I thought he was referring to Aristotle's argument in book 10 with the Nicomachean Ethics, where after he spent, all these books talking about the virtues, the practical life, he says, now we should return to life of study. And it turns out that is truly the highest life, but it is a life for the gods, not a life for humans. So we have the second best life, but it's still a life worthwhile. So I thought that's what he's referring to, but man, I went too quickly here. The idea that there is an even higher life, the life of pure theory, which is something that is talked about with Protagoras too. But humans aren't capable of that. So it shows something about the fundamental incomplete ability applied by the ideal of pure theory when it comes to us humans. Be humans. Does anyone else sound like that could be what he's talking about?
Well, but what is so puzzling here is the sort of I don't want to call it self-contradiction exactly, but to say that what makes it the good for human life is not that it achieves the theoretical life as an ideal that the gods have, But it does have something else. The second best life has the power of an accomplished completion. So you're talking about, telos, and sort of taking one's life as a whole and then being able to characterize it, for instance, as a happy life, a prosperous, a well-lived life. Is this life? And he said, you can't really tell this until somebody dies.
Right, exactly.
So you have to have the whole, because but within that wholeness, an accomplished completion, even if one limit of this completion is the fundamental incompletability implied by the ideal of pure theory. So part of the completeness of human life is that it is incomplete.
Mhm.
That is what I believe we call a paradox. And I'm not quite sure how to understand that, but it seems to be finitude. I mean, this is the finiteness of human existence, which is a part of human existence, and a part that you wouldn't wish away, because it wouldn't be a human existence unless it were finite. And yet that finiteness sets a limit to it, to its even being what it is. Okay. So it's the paradox part that drives me a little crazy here, just as there's the paradox part of the theoretical life is the best life, but the practical life is the best life too.
But why does it drive you crazy, Don?
Well, because it makes me
why
dizzy.
isn't it just fun? Why
makes me
isn't it
dizzy.
just fun?
I'm going to fall down, I get dizzy. But I hear you.
Just put in a paradoxical way that people doesn't need to emphasize the paradox of it. This feels very Heideggerian to me. The creature transcends itself. It just sounds like, Dasein, always going beyond itself, but at the same time not leaving its facticity behind and doing that. Right, so we go beyond ourselves, but we can't become thought thinking itself. We can't become pure theory in the process, but we can't do without that.
Yeah.
We achieve more because we have both. There's no completion to thought thinking itself. It just keeps thinking. It just keeps on thinking. Right. But we have a certain sort of a unity to our lives that occur only because we were finite.
Yeah.
John Beach, go ahead.
Not to answer what Don said, but just to supply a little bit of remind ourselves of a little bit of context of before Plato. Plato brought a very unique idea of philosophy into Greek thought, and before Plato, it was Gadamer talks about this, and we've talked about it before. Like philosophy meant like pure theory. It meant like mathematics. It meant contemplating the stars. That was, as Aristotle says for Anaxagoras, that was the, fulfillment and happiness and so on. And of course, Plato said, no, we can never really have full knowledge. That's only for the gods. For man, it's philosophy. It's dialectic. So that's the second best. And it's like the looking in the logoi as the second best journey in the Phaedo as well, which is really the best. And that whole metaphor is like, the Greek Navy, which defeated the entire Persian Empire, was with boats that you rowed. That was just, it was ironic. Even as he said it in the Phaedo. So I think that as you say, David and Don, it's full knowledge, final knowledge is only for the gods ultimately, and that's, otherwise there would be no such thing as philosophy. I think.
But is that an inversion of a more positive self-understanding of our finitude, right? Like to think that, well, gods can achieve the ideal of pure self-knowledge or pure theory, but we can't. it's almost as if we perceive that as our problem rather
think so.
than feeling like that's what makes us superior to the gods,
Right.
because gods can't ask questions, whereas
Oh,
we
no.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you, but no, there's no kind of like there's no transcendental God here. There's no the gods, the divine. This is a very permanent meaning right through Plato and Aristotle. It's something that's never questioned. But how do you epistemate, like knowledge, like where does science become unsatisfactory for Socrates? Well, when society is disintegrating, for example, and as it was in Athens at that time. And so it was a different, there was a different approach to knowledge and what philosophy was. Well, it was the love of Sophia. It wasn't, Gadamer says it wasn't Sophia. It wasn't pure theory. It was now the striving, as one would strive for the idea of the good, but never have disposition over it, never be able to conceptualize it or objectify it. And he says, and Gadamer is saying, no, Heidegger, that objectification that's happening that in your lectures on the sophists and so on, that was not happening with Plato at all. That's how I see it.
Well, he talks about that on page 4 at the top. He talks about Plato's introducing the idea of philosophia, not Sophia, but philosophia. And the upshot of that is not only do we not have disposition over everything in the world, we don't have disposition over ourselves. We don't have complete self. We don't grasp ourselves either, totally.
There's one thing I thought I'd just throw in just for fun, just quick. When he says, we're right to say that it's not wrong, it's not correct to say that Aristotle didn't understand Plato. I think Gadamer at one point said to say for any modern scholar, it's a little too ambitious for any modern scholar to make that claim that Aristotle didn't understand Plato.
Yeah.
That was a little
So,
heading there.
William,
Yeah, I was just wanting to go back to what was being talked about before between pleasure and knowledge, and a little bit of what Don was saying about not having a full disposition, control really over ourselves, or disposition over ourselves. He does talk about later in the book about not following into what's immediately attractive to us, but rather pursuing our authentic potential for being, and associates that with the good. So there's some sense of transcending towards some our potential for being, whatever that would be.
Yes.
So to me, it's a
Say that
sense that
again.
you are trying, although you may not be able to have a full control over it. I mean, there's a sense to strive for that, to live a life that's living out one's full potential.
Yeah.
What, William, do you remember where that's at? What page that's on?
Yeah, it's 61.
61.
That's
You have a
yeah.
very long version of it.
I think there's That's I think you can maybe find some different places, but that's there is on 61. So like he says in 61, so it certainly cannot be the immediate attractiveness that constitutes the goodness, something that is pleasant in itself, the sort of thing that is constituted by measurement in relation to the maximum of attractiveness no longer has the characteristic of present attractiveness at all. So it's in some sense as a measure of something, it's associated to the potential rather than what's immediately attractive.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I have that page, but I did find like a reference close to that where it's like the meaning of being, or trying to get at our being on page 8. Like
Okay.
right in the middle. Philosophy for Plato is dialectic. Dialectic as effort directed at the logos ousias, or word or reason of being is determined by the reasoning or meaning of being. Is that getting close to like our being that you were? Because I don't think I have page 61.
Yeah, no, I mean, the one that I was talking about, yeah, it's really like the potential for being. Like elsewhere, I think it relates a bit to well, what one is as well. So I think there's sort of, I mean, they probably relate as well. Let's see here. Yeah, like on 61, like, so it certainly cannot be the immediate attractiveness that constitutes the goodness, for instance. Yeah.
Just to be sure, you're reading from Plato's Dialectical Ethics, right?
Yeah, page
Even the text
61.
where he's discussing the Philemus, yeah, got it.
Yeah.
Could I respond to William there really
Yeah,
quickly?
John, yeah, please.
Well, that you're talking about that potential for being on page 61, which is a little bit surprising to me after having reread the introduction here, where the next sentence after what what Eric just read, the original motive of the Platonic idea is the question of the good, which asks simply what an entity has to be. That kind of surprised me, that sense of necessity, haben zu sein, I think it was. What an entity has to be, on the strength of which it can always be understood as dasselbe. So as the same, that same is dasselbe. I didn't think that was maybe the way to translate that, but in any case, in that passage, it surprises me a little bit that the Platonic idea is the question of the good, which asks simply what an entity has to be. That sense of necessity seems a little bit different than the language of potential that seems more frequent in Gadamer than the language of necessity.
Mm-hmm.
Did anybody else pick up on that?
Yeah.
That's the difference between the human and what is, like the entire ontology of the eidos. That's the distinction, and I think he goes on.
Yeah, right on the next page.
Yeah, at the top, he makes that distinction. It's a good point. Good question. The true being of everything that exists is the being of the idea. But then Dasein, which is not just a Heideggerian word, which is also Hegelian, or it's a German word, but he's looking at the Heideggerian fluid concept of Dasein as opposed to the Cartesian one. Gadamer is here. Yeah. But that's a good, no, that makes you stop and think. That brings you up short. Yeah.
In some sense, it could be argued it's a bit of both, because like later on, like I don't like bringing up later pages. I mean, he does talk about the good relating to the entities themselves as their own nature. So I mean, there is a little bit of that. I agree that it's going to be fluid for Gadamer anyways, but there is that eidetic element to some extent.
Eric?
And that's in the Phaedo. In the Phaedo too, he talks, what is the real being, the real cause of everything? It's the good. That's the ultimate ontological thing. And that's why everything that's why the eidos has its, eternal existence.
I think this is connecting, John Garner, what everybody's saying in relationship to your question that you posed, and going all the way back to Don's paradox, right?
We lost you, Nathan.
I think you accidentally muted.
Sorry. If we keep going on page 9, there's this issue with the paradox that Don was worried about too, that we're always in the tension between our understanding of the good and then the good that really is. And so that constant attempt, I think almost right in the middle of the page, he starts saying, well, that which the good really is, or to put it differently, how man, when he thinks he understands himself within the possibilities that are in fact attainable by him, does not obstruct and conceal what is really good, blah, 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 possesses an orientation toward what really is and can be, which thus also represents its almost possibility for being. This constant tension between what we understand to be good, whether it's through pleasure, through our concepts, versus always realizing there is the good that really is, the constant pull between the two.
And that we need to exhibit in our behavior. Because we need to make our life, make that good shine through it, as it were.
Through our striving or through our being?
Through our striving.
Okay.
Through our striving, through our orientation, the direction. I mean, this self-transcendence, this not being content with ourselves or something.
And man has something, Aristotle says, that things don't have, like man has prohairos, which is choice. And that's, beings don't have choice. Beings from nature don't have choice. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Maybe that helps me with something that, because Eric used it in the chat, the word urgency. And I was impressed on page 13. I mean, it sort of just comes out. So at the end of the top paragraph on the page, which goes on and on just before, I think he's talking about this phenomenological interpretation of historical texts, not a historicist's interpretation of historical texts. And what that phenomenological interpretation leads to is grasping what presents itself with the urgency of its substance and content. And feeling that, you know, when you understand it, you understand the urgency of what's being said in the Philebus. Why are they arguing about all of this? Why are they saying, you know, what are they talking about here? They're talking about something that's important. And maybe in a society that's disintegrating, in an individual who is lost, who can't find his way, there's an urgency about finding it, you know. And that's what you're trying to produce, that content in its urgency.
Well, finding it or living it, right? Like,
yeah,
all of these layers. Like, am I consistent with my own formulation of the good?
Yes.
But that's kind of what I was trying to ask you earlier, Don. Like, why does it result in an anxiety instead of a joy? I think this ultimately is a criticism of Heidegger, right? Like, why is angst the primary mode of access instead of joy or boredom, right? Why is it urgent in an anxious way instead of urgent in the, I'm so excited to do this?
Well, that is interesting. It is, after all, in Heidegger that anxiety is the way in which we are impelled to ask the question of being. You know, so there is a Heideggerian strain there. Yeah.
Could one of the points of writing on the Philebus be to raise joy or pleasure as a mode of disclosing being
Well said. Well said.
that turns the picture a little bit?
Because after all, in the end, it is not a choice between them. Knowledge has priority over pleasure, but the real answer is the mixture of both of them according to a right measure grasped by thinking.
But that takes the joy out of the Philebus because, right, you just had to explain the joke.
Right.
Well, I'm really thinking of that in the attitude of the humorless listener, right? Like right back to that line.
Yeah.
Up to that very last thing you said, Don, it was when you said then the measure that's provided by thinking. It was that last thing that gave Eric his you could have said provided by measure, which is determined by pleasure, right? It could have gone the other way and could have said whatever balance of these things in your life produce the most richness, we can become an ascetic life here and produce the greatest richness. So it feels like the very decision to say, whichever one provides, this is Gadamer now, the true understanding of the other, seems like it loads the deck. Already, if that's what we're going for, is a true understanding, then the life of contemplation is going to have a kind of trump card in the end. maybe like
True.
like in the Aristotle, what the Protepicus he's talking about, where Aristotle takes on which is better, the life of rhetoric and politics or a life of pure reason? Why do philosophy? And he has sort of his argument, well, you can't escape philosophy because this whole debate is really philosophy. And like, right, he's like, it's a bit cheating by saying, well, you know what? If we want to make sense of these things, guess what?
Right.
Here's what makes sense of it. As if making sense of these things is the only way to philosophically move forward. Maybe we could just
Yeah.
do what Eric does. I want to play around and enjoy the enjoyment of
No,
concept
well,
floating around.
I'm
and-
as anxious and dark as the next person. So I wish I could play with joy.
Okay.
But I think we're philosophers, so it makes sense.
It is.
We are doing a philosophical inquiry.
Yeah, I don't mean to drift off into a discussion of the Philebus. We've already got enough problems to deal with here, but without adding the Philebus to them. But part of Socrates' point in the Philebus is that pleasure itself requires knowledge. That if all you're talking about is just transitory sensations, then you're not anticipating pleasure. You're not, he keeps talking about the way it's implicated in the future. It requires the balance. It requires coming back, and it has certain features which are already implicating knowledge.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in a sense, yes, the deck is stacked against it. You can't even have a good time without thinking about it.
Right. Without deciding what
Well,
sort of
it's-
time you want to have.
David, is that part of the problem with like thinking that, like, if our mentality is to think that this deck is stacked against pleasure because we have to remember it, right? To already frame it in that way is to fix it in terms of stacked decks. And so what we need to do is question that framework for even thinking about the relationship between pleasure and knowledge, because as long as we think of it in terms of a stacked deck, we're already subordinating pleasure in a way that shows that we're missing an aspect of what Plato is getting at rather than being able to live it. I don't know.
I think that the objection is that we set these up as two separate things from the
Right.
start and then tried to rank them without realizing the ways in which conceptualization has a certain pleasure and pleasure has a certain conceptualization.
Yeah.
And the forms are not
Yes.
separate, they're mixed and they have implications. And
Right.
that's the game is, it was loaded from the start.
Yes.
And then once you realize it's
Right.
much more complicated than
Right.
and the question doesn't make sense, like you thought it did.
And dramatically, this is represented by the separation of Philebus from Protarchus, because Philebus won't engage in the discussion because he knows that if he engages in the discussion, he's already lost his cause.
Yes.
So he's not going to answer your questions. We'll let this other guy answer your questions because I'm not going to.
There's a number of those in Plato's dialogues where
Oh,
sort of
yeah.
the one who sees through this saying, I'm not even going on this path because, all right, I'm not gonna bother. I have a big question. It was when we were reading about Platonic dialectic and the Platonic idea. We have Gadamer presenting Aristotle as doing something different than Plato, a scientific philosophy based on concepts. I'm wondering if we have an idea of Plato doing something different than Socrates. Because Plato did something different than Socrates. He wrote these dialogues. Plato is often presented as having this theory of forms or ideas that maybe Socrates didn't have. And so is there an idea here that, well, there's Socrates with his life, or is Plato just representing Socrates' ideas through dialogue form, through written form, or is Plato doing something different? Yeah, John, I thought you might have something to say on this.
I thought I without sounding too dogmatic here, that is something that's a question that Gadamer is never interesting in even asking. He thinks that whole, he doesn't think there's any, it pays. Like it's because we really essentially only know about Socrates through Plato. There's Xenophanes and Aristophanes and a few other little hints here and there, but they're not the same Socrates that you find in Plato. And he sometimes he'll say about Plato's Socrates or Socrates in Plato, or it's something that he just says you just philologically, it's a fool's errand to try to even separate them. And this is another one of the key differences between Gadamer and everybody else that does Greek philosophy. He's far more rigorous in his standards for historical evidence and what's actually there, what we're allowed to speak about.
Yeah, that makes sense. I can understand that.
I'm not a professional philosopher like all of you people, but I wanted to ask about one paragraph that slips by, and I don't know how you feel about it or something. On page 11, it sort of starts on 10, but it is really on page 11, and he talks about an interpretive method that tries to cling fast to Plato's definition of concepts and develop his doctrine into a uniform system so that the individual dialogues might be criticized in terms of the objective legitimacy of their assertions and the validity of the logic used. And then he tucks in this little footnote and says, this is studying it from the viewpoint of modern logic and analysis and representing another extreme. We know better in terms of method. What do you make of that? I mean, this sounds like a pretty fierce polemic, actually. I don't know quite who he's thinking of, but
everybody.
Gosling in particular. He says Gosling. Gosling's book is exactly that. It is very much a we know better book about the philibus.
Oh. Well, I'll scratch that one
But
off
this
my
seems
list.
to be the typical textbook approach to teach. Here's Plato's views. Here's Aristotle's views. Here's Hegel's views, right? Like, I'm not actually reading any Plato, but I know everything about Plato's doctrine of the forms. Like, that's how, like, at least a lot of undergraduates get Plato. They don't even read the dialogues.
Poor undergraduates. I'd rather be an English teacher.
I mean, the idea that Plato's views developed could fit this as well, right? You have early dialogues where he's working on specific virtues closely connected to Socrates' way of doing things. And then you get the Republic and the Symposium, maybe the Phaedo, where he starts to come into his own and develop his own theory of forms. And now as an independent thinker, moving away from Socrates. And then later dialogues, he comes to see the limitations of various elements of the forms, of their separateness or their unchangedness. And Socrates maybe even drops out of later dialogues in favor of other people who can criticize theory of forms. And so this would all have the same style too, right? Here are these ideas that Plato, we can see Plato working toward them late in life, and we can see how he rejects earlier versions. And so the ideal Plato view is one we get at the end or something like this. Or you could stop along the way and say, oh, wait, we should have stopped here at the Symposium and gone no further.
Like, these are Plato's true views or something.
Yeah. As he's working them out over the course of his lifetime and rejecting them. But it belongs to the same, I mean, but that's a really common thing people do. It would belong to the same category. We can see what Plato's up to here. In light of his own later writings, we can see what he's up to here and how this is not going to last.
David, do you think that that's right? I'm just thinking of teaching right now. And do you think that that's a way in which we distance ourselves from being engaged by Plato's dialogues? Like, to be able to say, well, let's put Plato's dialogue in historical context with one another, as if we can just look at them at a distance from ourselves rather than being engaged by the questions.
I think it's a way of being engaged by a question. I mean, say you say, well, let's look at the method of collection division in the Sophist, in the Statesman, in one of those dialogues, and compare it to the way it is represented in the Philebus. And they're different. And ask, well, how are they different? How is one an improvement over the other? What are they trying to solve? I mean, I think those are really natural questions for philosophers to ask when we look at these things. And we ask, well, what is Plato after here? So I think it doesn't strike me as such a horrible path to go on, or a kind of denial of what Plato is trying to do. It seems to be a really interesting way to still engage the text with students, right? When Plato's talking about the unexamined life, what kind of examination is he talking about? What kind of examination does he model? And why does he have Socrates exam, right? Things like this. Is examining life getting out of the cave, getting away from all representation to grasping directly in a mystical, real, right? I mean, I think those are all ways of engaging the text, though they all do lead down this path of trying to say, okay, but what is Plato really trying to say here? Unfortunately, we just have a dialogue. What's he really trying to get at? And that's something from the start we've said that's a problematic approach to the dialogues and misses something really essential about them.
I just like to add to that point about superiority. We know better. In the preface to the idea of the good, he's at the last paragraph, he says, "It will be noticed that I have referred to recent scholarship only sparingly." Now, Gadamer knew recent scholarship probably better than any philosophy professor working today. But anyway, he says, "For one thing, I do not feel qualified to take a comprehensive stand on it. For another, the presuppositions of my own interpretation are all too different from those of other research." Now, how does he sum up his presuppositions? He says, "I ask that the reader take what follows as an attempt to read the classic Greek thinkers the other way round, as it were. That is, not from the perspective of the assumed superiority of modernity, which believes itself beyond the ancient philosophers because it possesses an infinitely refined logic, but instead with the conviction that philosophy is a human experience that remains the same and that characterizes the human being as such, and that there is no progress in it, but only participation. That these things still hold even for a civilization like ours that is molded by science sounds hard to believe, but to me it seems true nonetheless." So that's what he's saying here in this introduction, how we read Plato and how we can directly engage in this, participate in Plato's dialogues. And everybody has this feeling of superiority to Greek philosophy. They don't do that. They don't learn from Plato. And that's why nobody that teaches at university today is going to understand a single sentence that Gadamer writes about Plato, because they're just doing something totally different.
Wait. Except for us, though, right? Like
except for you guys.
Yeah, because we read Gadamer and we got the correct way.
Yeah, so I mean, Gadamer does not separate philosophy from philology, and they think you can do it historically. It's all here, sentence after sentence after sentence. He lays it out, and so that's why. I mean, you got to recognize the reality of what you're dealing with, and I mean, you must in the academic world, but I mean, that's the way it is.
Okay, we just have a few minutes left. Are there parts?
John, what page was that on again in the book?
It's the last page of the last paragraph of the preface, which would be page 6.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. And that was, but he wrote this in the 80s. And his position hasn't really changed from 1928.
Yeah.
It's just more subtly, it just hasn't been articulated. Like he worked a lot of things out in Truth and Method. He called it the Truth and Method, the theoretical aspect of his practical work that in interpreting Greek thought, and theoretical justification of it, which is why I never published this stuff on the Greeks, because he wouldn't have, for 30 years.
So with the few minutes left, is there something in here that you were hoping we get to that we didn't? Something that was confusing or interesting that I don't want you to leave dissatisfied at the end thinking, well, it was great, but there's that great line on page 6 and we never even talked about it. So this is your chance. Really? Go right ahead.
I don't know.
Maybe instead of that,
Yeah, thanks, Henry.
what John Beach just said reminds me of in the middle of page 4, where Gadamer writes, Socratic wisdom is not confirmed by its step-by-step growth, but instead its nature is to resemble the isolatedness and unrepeatability of a vision in a dream. I think that really rhymes with what John was saying.
Ah,
And I think it goes back to the fluidity too that we were talking about earlier.